This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Rely on Japan to have some of the most terrifying supernatural folklore imaginable. It's not so much that their ghost stories are necessarily scary in the traditional sense, it's that underneath every facet of Japanese lore, there is a tangible purpose to the fears and anxieties they inspire, hence how we've come to value many Japanese works of fiction as profoundly effective. Japanese storytelling is so fiercely rooted in its connection with culture, and how it shaped and influenced Japanese society throughout a multitude of generations, that it honestly takes a very specific set of knowledge to cover without misconstruing its historical context. The thing is, in Western society, we ultimately have a pretty simplistic view of Japanese horror because of inherent cultural differences alongside the reductive nature of pop culture at condensing everything to basic concepts like J-horror, if indeed it's a way of categorizing its uniquely provocative qualities amongst the ubiquitous iconography we're already so accustomed to in horror. There's a belief that Asian cinema tends to be bolder, more visceral and daring than Western cinema, and while I certainly agree in many cases, I don't think that's always entirely true. It's just that time and time again, like I said, we've become so familiar with how conservative a lot of Western cinema typically is with its established conventions, especially when it comes to the horror genre, that rarely does it have the same impact anymore. If you ever wonder why surreal and unusually expressionistic horror films in the West tend to be quite polarizing amongst common moviegoers, well, that's because mainstream horror ironically perpetuates the comfort zones that the genre should actively be trying to take us away from. Despite what the genre is, we simply just don't like things that are alien to us or play against our attitudes or sensibilities. In fact, a lot of people get super defensive about horror that ever so slightly deviates from the traditional model of accessible Blumhouse-style scares. Anyway, as Hollywood was beginning to emerge from the 90s horror crash, we did start to see a bit more willingness from some studios to finally embrace the unique supernatural folkloric qualities inspired by Asian horror's success during the late 90s, early 2000s. But this is Hollywood, so naturally the fast-track method ultimately became to just remake the instead. By the turn of the 21st century, American remakes had already had a pretty bad reputation amongst critics and audiences, but it was actually the rising interest in Asian cinema did remakes really blossom into the notorious reputation that they have today. And it all started with a ring. So let's talk about it. Cultural ignorance aside, like I said earlier, a lot of these studio system horror remakes were pretty much designed to serve more like comfort food than as unorthodox and sometimes introspective pieces of cinema. I do think some of them ended up with poor critical receptions more as a result of being unfairly compared to the original rather than as independent pieces of work, but that is disregarding how awful most of them genuinely were, including remakes within their own studio system that practically made them all look bad by default. However, what makes Gore Verbinski's version of The Ring so special amongst all of them is that it fundamentally became the remake that kickstarted the trend to begin with, thanks to its critical and commercial success, even to the point that it arguably stands as one of the best horror remakes ever conceived. For context, the original 1998 film by Hideo Nakata is based on the first book in a trilogy that nobody really read until the film's success in Japan. In fact, it was actually the second film adaptation with a 1995 TV movie that sticks closer to the novel's contrived and even more bizarre plot. The 1998 version takes the core essentials of the novel but tells a more subtle and accessible narrative. In the film version, the story follows a reporter and her ex-husband as they try to track down the origin of a killer videotape that upon watching it latches a curse onto the viewer, who is killed exactly 7 days later by a vengeful evil spirit called Sadako, who emerges from the nearest television screen. While that is the general gist of it, that last bit is actually the payoff to what is effectively a supernatural murder mystery, where the story is more focused on the characters trying to understand what exactly caused this curse to begin with, while dealing with the psychological torment placed upon them by said curse, leading us down a tragic road that reflects on our precious and fragile relationship with time. The film's most brooding feature is the emphasis placed on reminding the viewer how long the reporter has left to uncover the truth before her time is up, playing on this thematic association regarding how our lives are dictated by limited time, where the reporter's failure to meet this sudden figurative deadline will result in, well, death. There is no ambiguity to how valuable time ultimately is to her. It doesn't try to mask any of the supernatural stuff behind skepticism to make you think that it could all potentially just be a hoax. Instead, the opening is quick to establish that something truly terrifying is contained within the tape, with the death of her niece and her friends being the catalyst that inspires the reporter to investigate the bizarre circumstances around what actually killed them. The reason for this goes back to Hitchcock's bomb under the table logic. We as the audience know that something bad is happening unbeknownst to the characters, even if we are still left relatively in the dark about the specifics of the evil, but nonetheless the stress we feel for their ignorance really heightens the urgency of the story, especially when it plays on how fast time goes by. It's one of those films where you think that because time is of the essence, it would have a very tight, efficient pace to it, but bear in mind, while the characters do feel an increasing sense of dread as their paranoia gets to them more and more, there's still part of them that tries to rationalize things, meaning that some days go by without any major developments as characters get distracted with their own personal lives, and it escalates further panic and discomfort onto the audience. Believe it or not, in the book, the videotape isn't as elaborately supernatural. It just spreads a literal virus created from the fusion of Sadako's hatred, psychic abilities, and smallpox for some reason, thus causing the viewer to more or less die from a heart attack. Hell, watching the tape within the movie creates this jarring meta experience where I'm just left sitting there thinking, does that mean I'm f***ed too? I like that the film simplifies this to something a bit more abstract by deforming the victims' faces as if their soul has been ripped right out of them. It's a very subtle deviation, but it grounds itself more in the folkloric context of these kinds of urban legends. It makes it all the more haunting and mysterious because you'll never know what the hell actually happened. What benefits Verbinski's version is that he had the studio budget to greatly expand on the minimalist horror to make for a more intense and engaging experience. It has a very moody atmosphere with its emphasis on the cold, dreary setting of Seattle, and the makeup and visual effects really accentuate the petrifying horror, mixed with this Sergei Eisenstein montage style of erratic editing, juxtaposed with the small, deliberate escalating tension. I will say its greatest asset over the original is how it's much less anticlimactic. It's not as subtle, sure, but it helps the brooding tone of the story, especially with the more elaborate features added to the evil videotape that play more into the film's world by acting as a means of foreshadowing the impending evil. I mean, it does make for some odd creative choices, that's a given, but additional scenes like the horse being killed by the propeller of the boat were especially startling, while seeing the characters geek out over technicalities of the videotape is a nice touch, even more so from a nostalgic point of view. In context to the curse itself, the physical tape goes completely unanswered. It's a sort of Junji Ito deal where there's no point trying to explain such a crazy concept or it will otherwise distract from the logic of the story, especially when the contents of the tape are like a weird A24 produced experimental arthouse film, and the American version even jokingly compares it to a pretentious student film. I guess you could say the tape is treated a bit more metaphorical in nature, since the storytelling is rooted in Japanese traditions. As Colette Boulmian explains in her introduction to Japanese horror film, the tape and its power are like an embodiment of the fears and anxieties that technological change brought to social norms and traditions in Japan, especially with the influence of the younger, more liberal generation. Hell, you could even argue that the revelation of the curse acts as a sort of your wicked, selfish actions will become the responsibility of others in the future because the whole cultural angle doesn't really work in the American context. The story reveals that a doctor once had an affair with a psychic and tried to help her prove her powers to the world, but upon denouncement, the psychic's adopted daughter psychokinetically killed a journalist, driving the psychic to suicide due to slander and the doctor being sacked. Later, the doctor killed the daughter after she created the cursed videotape that contained her hatred for the world and its contemptuous ways, to which the reporter and the ex discover the iconic well containing her body and attempt to appease her spirit. The curse is then assumed to have thankfully been lifted now that the girl's body has been recovered, but what the reporter and the ex-husband don't realise is that this girl has always been an evil little bitch from the start, and it turns out that the reporter survived the curse not because they appeased her spirit, but because the reporter copied the tape and transferred it onto her ex-husband, who unfortunately still meets the same dire fate as her niece. Again, it's symbolic of perpetuating the vicious cycle of evil. One generation starts something bad, and everyone faces the consequences of those actions. And the only way to get rid of the problem is by, well, just passing it on to someone else. It really sends some very dire signals. Ju-on the Grudge kinda has a similar nihilistic approach to its conclusion. At the end of that story, the curse is spread like a virus to the location of where the victim is killed, so it basically moves from house to house where anyone who enters becomes part of that curse, and it just becomes a weird pyramid scheme until the entire population is wiped out. In effect, the evil of these stories is a force of change to society that cannot be stopped. It is inevitable, but the evil is always presented as the manifestation of a tragedy. When you look at it, the curse of the ring is caused by repression. There is no hint at a resolution. What the characters discover is that it's already too late to say sorry for the misdeeds of someone else's responsibility. The only real change to Verbinski's version of the story was cleaning up the backstory of the evil girl by having it be that she was simply tormenting her parents before her mother killed her and committed suicide. Here's the thing, this is purely down to your taste in horror, but that change does recontextualize the tone of the story away from tragedy and towards being plainly sinister. In the original, it does attempt to make the girl seem misunderstood until the twist where it turns out that she is just inherently evil, whereas the remake pretty much commits from the very beginning to keep her evil. I guess that makes her feel a bit more unstoppable because she doesn't seem all that human, but something that it takes away from the original is that tangible feeling of loss. The 98 version just feels more persistently uncomfortable with its eerie quiet and empty atmosphere. It makes dramatic moments feel more like effective jump scares, and it furthers the feeling of absence that death can bring to the world. The curse has a more nuanced presence in the Japanese version. It feels naturally somber by focusing on the psychological toll that death can have on people. The Ring never puts the emphasis on the death scene itself. Both versions focus on the impending feeling of dread towards death and the harrowing aftermath, showing us that death can be both quick and painful. As a whole, The Ring serves as a generalized introduction to Asian horror. It balances mystique and realism with the foreboding mood that defined the subgenre. It challenges the suspension of disbelief by taking a high horror concept and committing to making it feel real. Whereas many stories are quick to show their holes that take you out of the immersion, The Ring tightly grips you to its world, delivering a simple but powerfully suspenseful horror. There are of course sequels, but they follow the typical downward trend of trying to expand on the narrative that removes the mystery and horror necessary to keep you engaged long after it's over. I see films like The Ring as terminal horrors. They latch themselves onto and grow inside your imagination, leaving you with this crazy nightmarish feeling that something so ordinary and commonplace can so easily become the most horrific thing you've ever laid your eyes on. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. I scared myself while recording last night, hence why this bit is shot in daylight, but I guess it's high provocative concepts like The Ring that really inspire people to get into art and creative writing in the first place, and it's thanks to our sponsor at Skillshare that I've actually felt personally motivated and encouraged to finally get back to my own personal projects and just sit down and finish them. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators with over 30,000 different courses, ranging from art, design, and even things like freelancing and business for all you aspiring folks out there. Premium memberships give you unlimited access to join classes and communities that are right for you, whether it be to expand your career skills, creativity, or even if you're just curious. Watching their curated series in creative writing has helped me to brush up and refresh myself in areas like character and conflict, which is something I usually talk about in these videos, but it's always nice to have a second opinion on many things, while their productivity series is helping me to finally improve the efficiency of my workflow to find a better work-life balance, because as you can imagine, writing is both stressful and deeply time-consuming, especially when you get caught up on the wrong things like I usually do. If you want to give it a shot, Skillshare is giving away a free 2-month unlimited access trial to my subscribers who click the link in the description box below, and if you decide you want to stick around afterwards, it's only around $10 a month, so can you really put a price on knowledge? Well, apparently you can, so check out Skillshare below, and if you don't do it for yourself, do it for me, because sponsorships are what help keep the lights on. And until next time, stay very, very safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!